So today's topic obviously is spotting the signs of forced marriage, and specifically drilling down on how those of us who are working in the hotline advocacy space can spot those signs early on, ask the right questions, and respond in the most appropriate way. I'll tell you just a little bit about the Tahirih Justice Center Forced Marriage Initiative. We are a national program that serves women and girls and men and boys facing the threat of a forced marriage, or those who have already been forced into marriage and need help safely leaving. And we serve individuals across the country. And while myself and Halit are housed here in our headquarters in the Washington, D.C. area, again, we do want to make clear that we serve and we do outreach to folks across the country. So never hesitate to refer folks to us or see us as a resource for technical assistance. Briefly, just beyond the direct services that we do, that is really the bread and butter of what we're going to be talking about today, you can find tons of research, outreach and awareness raising tools and best practices toolkits on our website, which is the preventforcedmarriage.org. And you'll notice that's a separate standalone website from tahirih.org. We are an embedded project of the Tahirih Justice Center, which is a national nonprofit that does mostly pro bono immigration legal assistance in our 5 offices in Baltimore, DC, Houston, San Francisco, and Atlanta. So if you're looking for that forced marriage specific project information, that website is preventforcedmarriage.org. If you're looking for information about our immigration legal services and technical assistance, that website is tahirih.org. So now I'm going to hand it over to my colleague Halit to just walk us through a brief overview of the issue itself.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Casey. And so this is the definition that grounds us in the work that we do. This is a very widely used definition, but it is not necessarily universally accepted, and we'll talk a bit more about that in a little bit. So just so that we're all on the same page, Tahirih's working definition is: a forced marriage is where one or both people do not or cannot consent to the marriage, and typically involves elements of force, fraud, or coercion. We do not equate forced marriage with arranged marriage in every instance. Arranged marriage is a process in which families may take the lead, but the ultimate choice to marry remains with the individual. Choice here is not just about the individual, but it is also considering the timing or even the idea of getting married at all. So it should be a yes, I want to get married, a yes, I want to get married to this person, and yes, I want to get married at this time. And we see cases from time to time where the clients tell us, you know, I did say yes, I wanted my parents involved in this process. I did not mind the idea of an arranged marriage, but they promised me that I could wait until I finished college. But I'm still in high school, and no matter what I say or what I do now, they aren't stopping, they're not listening. And that then is when we see things shifting to a forced marriage situation, which can be very psychologically jarring if you had some control at some point, but now things are moving forward totally out of your control. So this next graphic really gives a better idea as to how this change can occur. But please keep in mind that these changes do not always occur in this linear way. It's not a perfect image, but it really does help us to capture the idea that a person can begin in what they feel is an arranged marriage process, but over time can find their ability to express preferences or to reject potential suitors that they don't think are a good fit eroded, and being told that they are being quote unquote too difficult or getting a bad reputation. And sometimes this means they are threatened with not being able to marry at all, maybe being told that they are ruining their siblings' marriage prospects by being too quote unquote picky, or faced with a marriage process going forward without their consent because the time has come. And they have no choice as their parents say that they know what is best for them. So it's at this point where family is dismissing the individual's wishes to not marry the person they have chosen, or not marry altogether, or the desire to wait until they're done with school or to enroll in college, that the process has really progressed to force as consent is really being dismissed. So the first question we usually get is, does forced marriage really happen in the United States? And the answer to that is yes, forced marriage is a global problem, and the US is not an exception. In 2011, Tahirih conducted a survey on forced marriage in immigrant communities in the United States, which received over 500 responses from 47 states. And this survey found as many as 3,000 known or suspected cases of forced marriage in the U.S. over a period of just 2 years. And about 2/3 of respondents stated that they felt there were hidden cases in their communities that weren't coming to the attention of service providers, indicating to us that this number really is just the tip of the iceberg. A few findings from the survey, which may further challenge our ideas about what a victim of forced marriage looks like. The survey found that forced marriage affects families of many diverse backgrounds and faiths, and service providers identified survivors from at least 56 different countries of origin. The religious backgrounds of survivors was also very diverse and included those from Muslim, Hindu, Christian, Buddhist, Jewish, and many other backgrounds as well. So forced marriage impacts people of all age groups, and in our work at Tahari, we have served clients as young as 12 years old and over the age of 50. The marriage can happen in the United States and or abroad, and those threatened with that overseas travel really face increased risk of isolation from help and a lack of rights and protection and resources. And important to note, individuals at risk that we work with include U.S. citizens, lawful permanent residents, other visa holders, such as student visa holders with many years of study left. This includes individuals who were born in the U.S., maybe even their parents were born in the U.S., so thinking of multi-generational immigrant households, as well as folks with no immigrant tie whatsoever.
And I did want to make a disclaimer that we're going to be using gendered language, a lot of she and her throughout this presentation. That is not to discount the experiences of men and boys who can also face the threat of a forced marriage, but the majority of victims do identify as female, and so that is why that's the language we're going to be using today. But our services are also provided to men and boys who come forward.
Thank you, Casey. A common question we get is, why would anyone force someone into a marriage? And the truth is that the answer to that question is very complex, and that the motivations really in each case vary and are often numerous and intersectional. There is often not one reason, even if folks are from similar backgrounds, etc. So what we try to do with this slide is illustrate how community level and societal level factors that are present across cultures and communities are just some of the root causes for why forced marriages exist as a tool of power, a tool of control, and oppression. And then relate those to the magnifying glass that you see, which include root causes, to individual and family level triggers that can be that case-specific situation for a forced marriage to occur. So I guess a brief example here would be, let's say you come from a community with strong feelings towards control of female sexuality, and you're rumored to be dating a boy from school, or have been seen by, let's say, a brother hanging around boys. And then your brother goes and tells your family. And your family opposes girls having contact with the opposite sex and engaging in sexual activity, or even just a perception that you're engaging in sexual activity may be enough for your family to speed up a marriage, or to decide that you getting married is in the best interest of your best interest, or ultimately the best interest of the family, as you're now getting this undesirable reputation. And that this will harm your future marriage prospects and perhaps even the marriageability of your siblings. Yeah. So victims face a broad range of coercive tactics. The threats to other people that clients care about is very common, and threats to the client usually comes from many sources. So unlike a traditional domestic violence situation, when typically victims may have like one abuser and maybe family or friends that they can rely on for additional support, with these cases, we're really seeing a network of abusers, a network that is enforcing or reinforcing this type of marriage. So emotional blackmail is very, very common. That also can include family, particularly mothers, threatening to commit suicide or self-harm to get the person to comply. Isolation and continuing to exercise control over the person's life, and that isolation may be a bit different to identify if the person has always been maybe around their family, around members of the same community, but this is the person that's not necessarily or may not be allowed any longer to really associate with other folks. And it may be these quote unquote house arrest type of situations where maybe they go to school, but now they have to come straight home and not able to socialize with anybody else. Social ostracism can seem like a very mild type of abuse, but if you've never been able to or not allowed to have friends or associate with folks who are outside of your family or outside of your religious group or your community, the threat of being disowned, the threat of being cut out of those situations, cut out of the family, or maybe even be told that you are dead to us is a very real threat, a very real fear that clients, whether they're minors or adults, really struggle with that. Economic threats are very common, particularly threats when I'm working with someone who is maybe wanting to go to college and, parents refusing to complete, let's say, the FAFSA or to give them the paperwork to get scholarships, or the fact that they'll cut them off altogether and just say, well, you'll be homeless, we won't be providing any resources to you. They take the car, they take the laptop, they take the phone, and at times even food and other things. As I mentioned earlier, threats of violence are very, very common. It's to the person, but also to folks the person may care about. And those threats could also be to family members or loved ones who are not in the country, maybe folks who are in family's home country, and that can be very, very scary to think about, that their safety is in your hands. Immigration-related threats, even with stable immigration status, many times our clients do not know what immigration reporting will actually do. We hear often clients say, I think I have a green card. My dad has been the holder of our documents the entire time. I've never seen them. My father has told me that they'll just deport me. They'll just send me back. So immigration-related threats are very, very common, especially now. Physical violence, that can certainly range. Death threats, again, to the person or others. Stalking is one that is also very common. And as these individuals are not just stalked by one person, but really a community, a network of folks, and it can be really hard to identify stalking when you're used to seeing, let's say, all your siblings, walking you to the bus stop, and all your siblings or your family members go to the same school, and you always walk together with them, or they walk you to work and things like that. But what's happening here is that many times those older siblings, or maybe even younger ones unknowingly, are reporting back to abusive family members who are just really keeping track of what this person is doing to really let them know that they don't have a way out. There's always someone watching. Yeah.
So now we're going to just speak briefly to the types of ways in which forced marriage is often overlapping and lurking behind other types of harm and abuse that folks on this webinar might actually be more expert in or more used to talking about and identifying and responding to. And I think the most valuable piece that is on this slide is a quote from an advocate, Debjani Roy, who wrote the first paper on forced marriage in the U.S. She was at Manavi at the time, which is the oldest South Asian domestic violence organization in the U.S., and she captured this phenomenon quite well in that report, where she says, advocates, and she's speaking from the shelter perspective, speak to many women who are facing domestic violence, abuse, and/or sexual assault in their marriage. Only later in these conversations does it emerge that the conditions upon which they may have been married were under duress, pressure, and ultimately against their will. And that is a really key piece to take away from this, is that we are probably working with and receiving calls from and providing services to women who have faced forced marriage in the past, but just not identifying that dynamic. And it's important to identify that dynamic because it is so different. And the moment of marriage itself is a moment of abuse, and was often preceded by lots of other forms of abuse and coercion to get that person to acquiesce to a marriage they did not want. And so the way we talk about that spouse or that potential spouse or those abusers is very different than the way we would normally have those conversations in a DV or SA or human trafficking setting. And there are just a few more complexities that inform best practices when we're doing support groups, for example, or mentorship, or planning long-term because their stay in shelter is likely to be longer because, like Halit shared earlier, they don't have that network of support. Anyone they might reach out to, they put at risk too for potentially helping them. And so this is the really big key takeaway for folks that I hope will stay with you as you continue to do your work from here. And we're just going to run through briefly how these intersections can look. And we're talking about child abuse, human trafficking, stalking, DV and family violence, female genital mutilation and cutting, rape, and sexual assault. So child abuse, I think, is pretty obvious. While the majority of the people we have worked with have faced the threat of a marriage that occurs after the age of 18, the majority of the folks that come forward have faced the threat and the abuse and the coercion throughout their lifetime. And many of the same coercive and abusive tactics that are used to get someone to feel they have no way out. Oftentimes they express, I feel like my only choices are suicide or to go through with the marriage. Taken together, they look like child abuse. And that is a really key thing to keep an eye out for because, yes, parents can tell you who you're allowed to hang out with. They can control your phone and computer use. They can tell you you can't have after school activities or pull you from school and tell you you're being homeschooled. Parents have every right to do that as enshrined in our Constitution, but when it's for a nefarious reason, when it's for the purposes of abuse, that's when we really have to name it. And we have a lot of work to do within the child protection system to get them to see this as in mandate and to have the protocols to respond appropriately in ways that are protective. Rape and sexual assault, it's important to understand the ways in which these incidences can be both a cause and a consequence of a forced marriage. I think it follows pretty logically that if you are forced into marriage, forced non-consensual sexual contact is a pretty common result. Forced consummation on the wedding night is often a common fear of our clients, and then forced sexual interaction thereafter. And so a lot of times, again, people are talking about acquiescing to the desires of their spouse and find it sometimes hard to name that rape and sexual assault can happen within marriage, which is a common dynamic, I think, with lots of survivors who are experiencing this within marriage. But again, that separate dynamic that it was not a consensual marriage from the outset. There is also the dynamic that survivors of rape or sexual assault in communities that feel very strongly about control over female sexuality and patriarchy and gender roles can sometimes see that as a precipitating factor or a trigger to get that person married immediately, to put a quote-unquote bow on that situation, and before too many people find out about the fact that they were assaulted or raped. And sometimes that means being forced to marry the rapist, and sometimes that means being forced to marry someone else. And so it's important to see the way in which it can be both cause and consequence and the way those things interact. DV and family violence, I think we talked about quite a bit already, but again, these forms of abuse, coercion, intimidation, and pressure, and fraud are often very, very similar to the types of things that you're already talking about in the DV spaces. Just really important to also identify the types of abuse and coercion and threats that were experienced prior to marriage, and in that moment of marriage, what did that look like? Stalking, Halit's already talked about, but again, family members and community members using that natural proximity to make you feel like you cannot safely reach out for help and that you have no options or resources. And then just briefly, human trafficking, we could do a whole presentation on this, and a common question we get is, isn't forced marriage just a form of human trafficking? Isn't it family perpetuated human trafficking? And the answer is just not that simple. There are some pieces of human trafficking that can be present in a forced marriage case. And even though forced sex within a forced marriage is not, a commercial sex act as defined by federal trafficking laws, arguably human trafficking can describe some forced marriage cases. Some forced marriages may also have elements of human trafficking if the driving motivation for the family is financial, to settle a debt or obtain a bride price or a dowry. But to be quite honest with folks, there is often not one driving factor, and financial motivations are pretty uncommon in the cases that we are working on. Sometimes they're present, but even when those folks call the human trafficking hotline, we work closely with the human trafficking hotline, and they're referring those cases to us saying, yes, there is an exchange of money for a bride price or a dowry, but it doesn't rise to the level or have the other, means and purposes that make this fall squarely within the trafficking bucket. We do sometimes see marriages turning into more of a servile marriage situation where there's a lot of domestic labor being forced and someone not being allowed to sleep and not being reimbursed. And if that's the case, again, if tools for safety like shelter or criminal prosecution or civil law or other resources in the trafficking space are useful to a survivor in that moment, by all means go down that road if that's what they want. But it is also important to note that we have heard from certain communities and survivors that even when this is happening, and it can look a bit like human trafficking, being labeled a trafficking victim and having their parents labeled traffickers is not something that is going to be helpful for them and will actually cause them more harm and more social ostracization in their community. So we're very careful when we talk about the overlap there, and it is a case-by-case basis and led by the survivor herself, how she wants to talk about her situation and experience. Female genital mutilation and cutting, again, the standalone training of itself, but just briefly to understand that the FGMC and forced marriage are red flags for each other. So in communities that practice FGMC, if someone is coming forward saying they are fearful of a forced marriage coming down the line, then you want to be comfortable asking about FGMC, whether or not they know they've had it in the past, or whether or not they fear FGMC is going to be part and parcel of preparing them for the marriage. We also likewise want to say if someone is coming forward and talking about the fear of future FGMC, or finally, for the first time in their life, disclosing that they were cut at a young age and they're in need of long overdue mental health or physical health support for the sort of myriad of follow-on consequences that female genital mutilation and cutting can have, you will also want to ask around forced marriage and just marriage practices in that community, because again, they often go hand in hand, are very intertwined practices. So when someone comes forward about one, always being comfortable asking about the other and the interplay of the two. And again, I know we're going very fast. It's the holidays. We have an hour. We're throwing a lot of information at you, but if you have questions, please feel free to ask them. And I want to make sure I didn't just skip a slide. Okay, great. So I'm handing it back off to Helene. Or no, I said I would do this one. Yep. Okay, so just briefly, common case dynamics. I think we mentioned already this sense of coming forward feeling like I have a choice between suicide, quite frankly. A lot of folks coming forward with suicidal ideation and death wishes, or going through with the marriage and feeling like they're at a loss as to what to do and not sure what other directions they could go in. This really deep sense of a lack of independence. Like, I have been told my whole life I'll never make it on my own. You know what happens to people who leave the family, who leave the fold, who leave the community. You will be homeless. You will become, commonly our clients are told they'll become prostitutes, or they will be trafficked by someone else. And so there are a lot of reasons why someone feels very convinced of their own inability to live independently. Fear of consequences, not only to themselves, but very importantly to other members of their family. We are often dealing with multiple victim households where mom is both a perpetrator of the forced marriage and an enforcer of that decision, but is also herself a victim of domestic violence coming from the head of household. And so our clients are often saying, I'm going along with the forced marriage. I'm pretending to consent because I'm protecting my mother from abuse. I know what the consequences for my mom will be if I run away, and I'm protecting her by behaving, quote unquote. And that is a very hard dynamic to navigate, but something we need to be comfortable talking about. The other piece being, I know if I leave or if I refuse, they will simply transfer the threat to my sister. And so can we also serve that sister? Can we help that person to see their own needs and their own safety as primary to them, and finding ways to have those conversations in a way that is empathetic and client-led, but also empowering to them to put their own safety first. Threat is from many sources. We covered urgency around facing imminent travel abroad if the marriage is overseas. Those are some of the hardest cases to triage, and that is what Halit is expert in. So if that's coming up in any calls, we really do urge folks to reach out to us. We do tons of safety planning for overseas travel, and we do liaise with the U.S. State Department and on-the-ground NGOs for emergency repatriations if someone is taken overseas against their will. And reluctant sponsor scenarios, these often look like folks coming forward after the marriage has already taken place, and they're not quite sure if they want to leave the marriage or not, but they surely do not want that person joining them in the United States and gaining citizenship status as a result of their relationship and their marriage with our client. And so sometimes immigration paperwork is filed without their knowledge, and we are able to check with USCIS if something's been filed in their name and they never even signed it. Sometimes they are, again, coerced and forced to sign. Either way, we have built a close relationship with USCIS such that we can safely and anonymously withdraw these visa applications in a way that does not alert the family or the petitioner and does not then lead to immigration fraud charges coming against our survivors that we're working with because of the fact that they were forced or coerced or even paperwork being sort of forged in their name. So that is a very careful process and is not something that you can just say, reach out to USCIS and cancel the visa petition. There are a lot of potential risks and consequences to doing it that way, as opposed to going through the relationship that the Tahirih Justice Center has built with U.S. immigration on this particular issue. So if that's coming up, please refer folks to us so we can walk them through that process in a confidential and anonymous way. So Khalid, I do see a question here. I think it's around guidance about talking to survivors about FGMC. And so we do have a handout on how to start those conversations from sort of client-centered way. And they, I believe, are not live up on our website as yet. It is an insert in our larger toolkit around the framework for responding. And so if you want that guide, you can reach out to us via email. Our email will be at the end of the PowerPoint. And we can sort of liaise with you directly on when to use that, how to use it, and other resources that exist, because there are a lot of other great organizations that input into that guide that we have. And again, that is a sort of a whole nother presentation. A question that, will we be sending out the PowerPoint? Yes, we will. And what would be a victim-centered way to talk about FGMC? Okay, so we did address that. All right, thank you guys for your questions. I think we'll move on to the next slide. All right, so briefly, just because we promised to touch on it and it is a hot topic right now, if folks are calling you and they're identifying as minors, they could still be facing the very real threat of being forced into marriage here in the United States, because child marriage is legal in almost every state in the US. We have data that shows well over 200,000 children were married between 2000 and 2015. And while we do not equate every single child marriage with forced marriage, we see the majority of these cases having really concerning factors. Looking at the data, the vast majority of cases of minors getting married involve a female child marrying an adult man, sometimes decades older, pregnancy exceptions versus statutory rape laws, and age-based laws on assault are totally out of sync. So what we are condemning as automatically criminal in one space, we are condoning as marriage in another civil space. And again, parental consent exceptions to the minimum age of marriage across the US mean that minors below 18 can often be married if one or both parents consent to it. But if your parents are the ones forcing you, if your parents are the ones abusing you, then that is not a protective factor. So we see a lot of dysfunctional legal regimes across our 50 states, and only Delaware and New Jersey have a bright line of 18. Many other states have passed laws that make it exceptions only for emancipated minors, but there is a lot of work still to be done in this space. All that is to say, information on your particular state's law is available on our website, tahirih.org/childmarriage, and that not to dismiss out of hand the idea that a minor on US soil could be forced to marry. It happens all the time, and there in most states are no checks in that system or that process to make sure the minor themselves is consenting and is protected from abuse. So specific challenges when it is a minor who is facing the threat of a forced marriage while they are still a child. I think across the board, folks with just a huge lack of knowledge of their rights and protections, parents often use that sort of broadly understood idea that, like, until you're 18 and you live under my roof, you have to abide by my rules. And it's really hard to parse out like what actually is true about that, but that in the marriage space, that doesn't apply. Like you cannot actually force me to marry, but you do have all these other powers of parental rights. Very hard and nuanced thing to parse out as a minor. Perceived lack of capacity or actual lack of capacity or standing to initiate court action on your own behalf. You can't take out protection orders on your own behalf in most states. You need a parent or guardian to do so. But what if it's your parent or guardian who's the one who's abusing you? It gets very complicated. Law enforcement defers to the rights of parents in most instances, and even when our clients have successfully run away, without proper planning, they are often returned to their parents' home by police. Children are seen as delinquent, parents are seen as benevolent. Child Protective Services in most states don't see this issue as a mandate at all, and at times when they do get involved, their actions tend to just tip off parents that the individual is reaching out for help, but leave that child in the home, and then abuse escalates, and we have actually seen children be taken out of the country the very next day after a CPS visit to the home. So that is a really tricky space to navigate, and we do hope that you will reach out to us in cases where it feels like a mandated report might be required, but we know that that CPS response might escalate the risk for this person. Shelter and alternative housing is really hard to secure for minors, not impossible. We do it all the time, but it takes those special relationships and at times may require a family law attorney who's well-versed in representing minors. Those are relationships that we have and are happy to share, but again, not impossible, but more difficult. And I think the biggest piece here is that the risk of repercussions if a minor reaches out for help and is unsuccessful are incredibly high. And so we have to keep that in mind. And what that is often referred to in this space is the one chance rule. Survivors often have planned for many days, if not months, that one moment where they'll have the opportunity to call or send a safe email or use a friend's phone. And if we don't get them the information and the help that they need in that moment, they may never have another moment to reach out for help. So that's really critical. So quickly, a little bit more about the legal landscape. There are no federal level forced marriage criminal laws. The de facto minimum age to sponsor someone to come from overseas as your fiance or spouse is 18, but very importantly, there is no minimum age for that foreign beneficiary. So a US citizen can bring in a spouse or fiance of any age to the United States. And the data that we have seen has shown some really disturbing ages and age differences that show that US citizen adult men are preying upon the vulnerabilities of foreign females who are very, very young, bringing them into the United States as brides, isolating them, and abusing them. And that is a loophole in the immigration system that is allowing that to happen currently. State level, we already talked about CPS mandates, these falling through the cracks in that space. POs often do not cover the type of contact by whom, and minors' ability to petition on their own is extremely limited. And just so you know, in case you're in one of these states that does have a state-based criminal offense, we have never seen them used towards a prosecution, but we do educate our clients, if they are from one of these 9 states or 2 jurisdictions, that this is a tool in their negotiation toolkit. If they are being threatened with a forced marriage, then they might think in the next argument that we have, it is safe and effective for me to say, actually, in Oklahoma, it's illegal to do what you're doing, and if you don't stop, I'm going to call the police. And in some families, that's enough. And in some instances, that has been a really helpful negotiating tool. And in some cases, they say, oh, I would never threaten to call the police on my parents. That will only make things worse. But we never withhold that information. It's a piece of their toolkit, and they use it or not as they choose. So I see a question here. Is there a minimum age for marriage? There is not one across the board. Every single state in the US has a different minimum age of marriage regime, and you can find every single statute at tahare.org/child marriage. We have a 50-state statute compilation, and you can see there sort of where your state lands, what the actual minimum age is, depending on the exceptions allowed for pregnancy, parental consent, and other things. And that should inform you more closely than what we can cover on this webinar today, because there are so many nuances across the 50 states. And that led perfectly into this slide, but you'll see it's color-coded. Green has minimum 16, yellow 15, red 14, and in the gray spaces you'll see there is actually no lower minimum age limit, and only a few have that 17 or 18. But again, if you want your specific state's rules, you can find that on our website in the statutory compilation. And now I'm handing it back to Halit for the real bread and butter of this presentation, which is how to screen and respond.
Thank you so much, Casey. And I'm actually going to go through all the bullet points on this slide, highlighting the red flags. So first one, siblings or other family history of forced or early marriage is really important. So thinking about when you're working with someone and perhaps mapping or the family dynamics, or asking a bit more about the family dynamics is very important. Often they may not identify the marriages as forced, but when you get into asking a little bit more about when the marriages took place, the ages of the participants, then you may have a bit more to go on. Family disputes or conflicts where there is a resolution with honor violence or mentioning honor violence or honor killing is another big flag. Individuals that are reported missing or siblings who have a history of running away is often very common. And here you also have parents or family members utilizing that runaway status also against the person. So when they do return home, particularly if they are minors, then now law enforcement or others in the community know this person as a troubled youth and that they're a frequent runaway, and not necessarily asking the reasons why they're running away. Unreasonable restrictions by parents, such as house arrest, and we covered it a little bit earlier, thinking of isolation, thinking of someone in the client's particular age and what would truly be reasonable for them to be maybe involved in community activities, things of that sort. Not being allowed to speak on the phone or communicate with others could also be a flag. By itself may not be so big, but when you add it to the rest of the puzzle, then you have more pieces there. Planned or threats of unusual travel overseas is very big, particularly when you're working with someone and travel is being discussed somewhat out of nowhere. Maybe they had no idea. Their family saying, "Oh, next week we're traveling to grandmother's home country, or we're going to visit a sick family member. You've never met this aunt, you've never met this grandmother, and we want to make sure that you get to meet them." Or traveling for someone else's wedding, and this one is very, very common. And even more common when you are working with someone where you already have flagged the potential for forced marriage, and now their family is okay with them resisting the marriage, but now there's still going to be some travel for someone else's wedding, right? And it may be that they truly know someone who's getting married, but they don't know that it'll maybe a dual wedding and that person's going to be married with them as well, or that they themselves are going to be left and married. Unexpected or unfamiliar visitors or house guests, again, one that by itself may not be such a big flag, but when you add it to the other pieces, when you add it to, someone who is now, who has shared with you this maybe fears of overseas travel, that can be another big flag. As Casey mentioned earlier, health concerns such as FGMC, or you may not hear FGMC, you may hear virginity tests, or maybe this increased attention to gynecological health or fertility. We've covered a bit about early unwanted, or maybe even someone who's hiding their pregnancy. We could have many assumptions as to why that is, but really asking in a non-judgmental way, that could give us some clues as to maybe they're hiding their pregnancy because they know a marriage will take place. Unusual decline in behavior, performance, or attendance at school or work. So someone who maybe started out with all A's, perfect attendance, and now all of a sudden they have F's, or they're not attending. Maybe they're not necessarily truants. They're not breaking laws then, but you're flagging the fact that they're no longer showing up to as much as they usually would, or not necessarily able to pay attention, or maybe even their behavior. They used to be really nice and calm, and now things are really changing. There may be more causing quote unquote more problems at school. A fear of upcoming holidays and breaks goes right with see travel overseas, or it's working with someone who is not necessarily so happy that winter break is coming. When you're asking them, what are you going to do for vacation? They may not necessarily be open to sharing with you, or maybe they have no idea what's going to happen after that vacation. They may be sharing with you, oh, I don't know if I'm going to come back to work. I'm not sure if I'm going to go back to the school. I don't know when I'm coming back from this trip. So fear of upcoming holidays is very big, and really that's peak season for us. So thinking of winter break, spring break, summer break, which makes sense, right? Because there's no teacher or counselor. There aren't, these protective factors, after school care or tutors who typically would be used to seeing this person. It's not unusual to not see students during those times. So this is also key. And in thinking of that vacation overseas, when you're, working with someone who is having this vacation in the middle of the school year, that also is a really big flag. Maybe they're not waiting for a break. Something has happened, something is going on that is increasing the need for the marriage to occur. Mental health concerns, as Casey mentioned earlier, depression, anxiety, isolation, emotional withdrawal, self-harm, or suicide attempts are also very common. Former child brides are substantially more likely to have a current mental health disorders, such as specific phobias. And most of the clients that I've encountered have mentioned suicidal thoughts or self-harm. So I'm sure by now you're wondering, well, how do you ask if someone is facing a forced marriage situation? And for many of the individuals that we've worked with, talking to a stranger about private family matters is really difficult. They may feel like they're breaking confidence or trust with their families. They may be worried about how you're going to perceive them, how you're going to perceive their community or culture. And honestly, they could really just be scared about the consequences. So often you do need to make some sort of small talk, or usually spend a few minutes, introducing yourself, your work, before really digging into asking the questions. So trust and respect, regardless of the age of the person, is really important, and especially not being judgmental about members of their family. And really important here and key overall is confidentiality restrictions, and for you to really share those limitations, because it's really easy to be empathetic, to give us a call, to give that person our contact information so they can get further support, and so you can continue to work on what you need to. And if you're in the role of serving the entire family, then here we can, in us stepping in, we could really avoid a conflict of interest for you. So some follow-up questions you have now on this slide, and they may seem, a bit odd to ask. How does marriage typically happen in your family or community? How did your marriage happen? But if you think about it, maybe if you have a colleague at work, someone who maybe you don't know that well, but they show up to work and they're now engaged. Typically, we have questions. We may say, where did you get engaged? When is your wedding going to be? How does your family feel? How do you feel about your engagement or the marriage, right? So we already have these, in our system. It's just, reading over them and, getting a bit more comfortable. But you can certainly start with those natural questions. And on the handouts that you have here, there's a handout called it's a tip sheet for hotline advocates. And even if you're not a hotline advocate, I think that handout can be really helpful in being able to have a deeper understanding of what to do, what to ask, and what not to say. Because typically you're going to be the one that needs to identify the red flags to then be able to ask. For the most part, folks are not coming to us stating that they are facing a forced marriage. So it's really important to review, these questions and really think of your caseloads, and perhaps who do you need to talk to a little bit more to get a bit more information about that family dynamics. Okay, so here we had the checklist, always do and never do. So always let the individual know they have a right to say no to a marriage they do not want, even if they are a minor. This may be the only time, you may be the only person who is telling them this. And it can be really reassuring when they're hearing that they have a right to say no to a marriage that they do not want. important to reassure individuals that no religion sanctions forced marriage. And we know as advocates that religion can be a very protective factor for the clients who we work with. And it is our perspective that no religion sanctions forced marriage. And the type of reassurance is often really critical when you have someone feeling like they're breaking their